A teddy bear can carry many things: love, comfort, memories of childhood innocence. In October 1997, one teddy bear in Rome carried something else entirely, something that would determine whether 300 people lived or died. The 7-year-old girl holding it had no idea what she was about to deliver. The Mossad had spent 49 years perfecting the art of making impossible decisions, ever since the agency's founding in December 1949, when Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion tasked it with ensuring that the Holocaust would never happen again by any means necessary. Yael Ravid joined the organization in 1992 at age 27, drawn by the same motivation that drove most Kaidan operatives into the life, which was the understanding that moral compromises made in darkness prevented catastrophic losses in daylight. She specialized in long-term infiltration operations across Europe, spending months or even years building cover identities that could withstand scrutiny from intelligence services that had been hunting Israeli agents since the Munich Olympics massacre of 1972. Her particular expertise involved psychological manipulation, the subtle art of becoming exactly the person a target needed to trust, which required her to study behavioral psychology, cultural anthropology, and the kind of method acting that made her previous life as Yael Ravid disappear completely when she assumed a new identity. The work destroyed relationships, made normal life impossible, and required her to do things that haunted her during the few hours she managed to sleep. But she continued because the alternative was allowing people like Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh to succeed in their mission of killing as many civilians as possible. Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh had been on the Mossad's priority target list since 1994, when intelligence intercepts revealed his role in developing chemical weapons for Hamas, specifically his work on stabilizing sarin gas for use in enclosed spaces like subway systems and shopping centers. He possessed a doctorate in chemical engineering from Damascus University, spoke 5 languages fluently, and had the operational discipline to live under deep cover for years without making the mistakes that got most wanted terrorists captured or killed within 18 months. For 3 years he had lived in Rome as Professor Marco Rossini, teaching organic chemistry at Sapienza University, living in a comfortable apartment in the Prati district, married to an Italian music teacher named Giulia, who had no knowledge of her husband's real identity, or the fact that her marriage was part of his cover. The couple had one daughter, Sarah, who turned 7 years old in October 1997 and attended the International School of Rome, where she excelled in art class and struggled with mathematics. Al-Mabhouh's cover was so complete that Italian intelligence had no file on him. His university colleagues considered him a brilliant but unremarkable professor, and his neighbors knew him as the friendly man who always helped carry groceries for elderly residents. The breakthrough came in August 1997, when a Mossad signals intelligence unit intercepted a coded message that referenced a meeting in Rome between Al-Mabhouh and Hassan Khalil, a financier who moved money from Iran to Hamas cells across Europe. David Shamir, who commanded Mossad operations in southern Europe from a cover office in Tel Aviv, assembled a team of 12 operatives and gave them a clear directive, which was to identify everyone in Al-Mabhouh's network before attempting capture, because arresting him alone would only cause the other cells to disappear and continue their work. Surveillance teams confirmed that Al-Mabhouh met with at least 6 different individuals over a 3-month period, using a rotation of cafes and parks in Rome, but the meetings were brief and conducted with sufficient counter-surveillance to make audio recording impossible without getting close enough to risk exposure. The team needed inside access to Al-Mabhouh's apartment. Specifically, they needed to plant listening devices that could capture conversations when the network members inevitably visited for the planning session that Signals Intelligence suggested would happen in October. Yael proposed the operation during a secure video conference in late September 1997, presenting it as the only viable option given the timeline and the target's security consciousness. She had spent 6 weeks conducting surveillance on the family, learning their routines, identifying vulnerabilities, and building a psychological profile of Giulia Rossini that revealed a woman who was isolated in Rome, missing her family in Naples, desperate for friendship with someone who understood the challenges of raising a child in a foreign city. The plan required Yael to manufacture a chance encounter with Giulia at the International School of Rome, develop a genuine friendship over several months, gain access to their home through that friendship, and then use Sarah's upcoming birthday as the delivery mechanism for sophisticated listening devices disguised as a gift. David Shamir listened to the proposal in silence, his face revealing nothing, while the other team members shifted uncomfortably because everyone in the room understood exactly what Yael was suggesting and the ethical boundary they would cross by using a 7-year-old child as an unwitting courier. Shamir approved the operation with one condition, which was that Sarah would never be placed in direct danger and would never know she had been used, meaning the operation had to be executed with such precision that the child would remember only receiving a beautiful teddy bear from her mother's kind friend. Yael became Elena Marchetti, a translator from Florence who had recently moved to Rome for work, wearing contact lenses that changed her eye color from brown to green, speaking Italian with a perfect Tuscan accent, carrying forged documents that would withstand background checks by anyone except Interpol. She engineered the first meeting with Julia on October 2nd outside Sarah's school, offering to help when Julia struggled to carry both her cello and Sarah's school bag to the car. The conversation lasted 7 minutes, long enough for Yael to mention she was new to Rome, looking for recommendations on everything from grocery stores to piano teachers for the daughter she had invented as part of her cover story. The friendship developed exactly as Yael had predicted, with Julia calling her 3 days later to invite her for coffee, desperate for adult conversation with someone who spoke Italian as beautifully as Elena did. They met twice a week for coffee, then progressed to weekly dinners at various restaurants across Rome, and finally Julia invited Elena to their apartment on October 15th for dinner, which gave Yael her first opportunity to observe Al-Mabhouh in his home environment. He was charming, attentive to his wife, playful with Sarah, and completely convincing as Professor Marco Rossini, but Yael noticed the way his eyes tracked everyone who entered the building, the manner in which he positioned himself to see both the apartment entrance and the windows simultaneously, and the micro-expression of assessment that crossed his face when Julia introduced Eleanor. He was evaluating whether she posed a threat, running the same mental calculations that Yael herself performed constantly, and she knew in that moment that any operational mistake would result in her death and the collapse of the entire mission. Sarah's birthday was October 29th. Julia mentioned during coffee on October 20th that she was planning a small party, just family and a few school friends, and Elena offered to bring a special gift. The teddy bear was custom-made by Mossad technical specialists, containing a listening device smaller than a grain of rice embedded in the stuffing, along with a transmitter that could broadcast for 72 hours before the battery died. Oren Katz, who designed the device, assured Yael it was completely undetectable unless someone physically dissected the bear and examined the stuffing under magnification. The bear looked handmade, with careful stitching and a small tag that read, "Made with love in Florence," and which matched Elena's cover story. It was perfect. It was innocent. It would work. Yael held the bear during the final briefing on October 27th, feeling its weight in her hands, knowing that this single object would either reveal the entire Hamas network in Europe or expose her operation and likely get her killed. She wrapped it carefully in bright paper covered with balloons and butterflies. The morning of October 29th arrived with rain falling across Rome, the kind of cold autumn rain that made the ancient stones glisten and turned the Tiber River into a sheet of grey metal. Yael arrived at the apartment at 2 in the afternoon, carrying the wrapped bear and a bottle of wine. 12 other Mossad operatives were positioned throughout the building and on the street outside, ready to move if Al-Mabhouh detected the operation. Sarah answered the door wearing a princess costume, her face bright with excitement. The apartment was filled with balloons and streamers. Julia hugged Elena with genuine warmth. Al-Mabhouh watched from the kitchen doorway, his eyes measuring everything. 4 other men sat in the living room, men Yael had never seen during months of surveillance. Hassan Khalil was one of them. The others were unknown. This wasn't just a birthday party. The planning meeting was happening today, right now. While children played and ate cake, these men would discuss operations that would kill hundreds. The teddy bear suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Sarah was already reaching for it, her small hands grabbing at the bright paper. Al-Mabhouh was walking toward them. The device would activate the moment Sarah touched the bear. There was no turning back now. Sarah tore through the wrapping paper with the focused intensity that only 7-year-olds possess, revealing the brown teddy bear with its button eyes and red ribbon. She hugged it immediately, pressing her face into the soft fur, declaring it the most beautiful bear she had ever seen. The device activated on contact. Somewhere in a van 3 blocks away, Oren Katz saw the green light appear on his monitoring screen. The transmission had begun. Al-Mabhouh stopped his approach, smiled at his daughter's happiness, and returned to his guests in the living room. Yael released the breath she had been holding for what felt like an hour, but was actually 7 seconds. The next 90 minutes unfolded with the surreal quality of watching 2 completely different realities exist in the same physical space. Sarah played with her school friends in her bedroom, the teddy bear clutched under one arm while she showed everyone her art collection. Julia moved between the kitchen and living room, serving coffee and pastries to the men while managing 7 children hopped up on birthday cake. Yael helped with the kitchen work, playing her role as the helpful friend perfectly, keeping her hands busy and her ears open, while the men in the living room spoke in low voices that occasionally rose above the children's noise. They were speaking Arabic, switching between dialects, which told Yael that at least 2 of them came from different regions and were being careful about operational security even here. Al-Mabhouh controlled the conversation with the quiet authority of someone who knew his expertise made him irreplaceable, occasionally glancing toward the kitchen to ensure his wife remained occupied, completely unaware that every word spoken in that apartment was being transmitted to Israeli intelligence analysts. The 4 men with Al-Mabhouh represented exactly the kind of network that made him so valuable and so dangerous to leave operational. Hassan Khalil sat closest to the window, his expensive Italian suit and Rolex watch marking him as the financial connection, the man who could move millions of dollars through legitimate banking channels. The second man was younger, perhaps 30, wearing jeans and a leather jacket, speaking with a Lebanese accent, and displaying nervous energy that suggested he was either new to this level of operation or carrying something dangerous. The third man was older than Al-Mabhouh, maybe 55, with grey hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent considerable time in harsh climates, speaking rarely, but with an authority that made the others listen carefully. The fourth man troubled Yael most because she recognized him from Mossad briefing files as Tariq Hamza, a logistics coordinator who had been linked to 3 different bombing operations across Europe, but never with sufficient evidence for arrest. The breakthrough came at 3:45, when Al-Mabhouh's voice rose slightly as he explained something technical to the group, and Yael heard him reference a shipment arriving in Munich on November 15th, which was 17 days away. The transmission quality was exceptional, clear enough that Oren would be capturing every word. She needed visual intelligence. Specifically, she needed to see what documents or materials they might be examining, but moving into the living room would be too obvious. Sarah solved the problem by running into the kitchen and demanding that Elena come see the palace she had built, with blocks in the bedroom, grabbing Yael's hand with the insistence that children use to move adults where they want them. Julia laughed and told Elena to go. Yael allowed herself to be pulled through the living room, moving slowly enough to observe that one of the men had a leather portfolio open on the coffee table, displaying what appeared to be shipping manifests or customs documents. The children's party ended at 4:30 when parents began arriving to collect their young guests. Yael hugged Julia goodbye, received a kiss on each cheek from Sarah, who was still carrying the teddy bear, and walked out of the apartment building into the grey afternoon, knowing that the device would continue transmitting for another 67 hours. She walked 3 blocks before entering a cafe, where Oren sat at a corner table with a laptop. He did not look up as she sat down, simply slid a newspaper across the table with a small note tucked inside that read in Hebrew, "Active. Clear signal. 12 analysts processing. Meeting continuing." David Shamir was listening to the transmission from a secure facility beneath the Israeli embassy when Tariq Hamza mentioned the name that changed everything, which was Abu Nidal, spoken in the context of a meeting scheduled for November 8th in Milan. Abu Nidal had been one of the most feared terrorist operatives of the 1980s, responsible for attacks in 20 countries that killed or wounded over 900 people. But Israeli intelligence believed he had been dead since August 2002, when Iraqi security forces reportedly killed him in Baghdad. If Hamza was referencing the actual Abu Nidal and the man was alive, then every assumption about the current threat landscape was wrong. If Hamza was using Abu Nidal as a codename for someone else, or for an operation, then the Mossad needed to identify the actual meaning before November 8th, which gave them 10 days. Shamir made 3 secure phone calls in rapid succession, pulling resources from other operations, activating surveillance teams in Milan, and requesting that the Caesarea unit place operatives at every location where a high-level terrorist meeting could plausibly occur. The transmission ran for 71 hours and 16 minutes before the battery died at 7:22 in the morning on November 1st. During that time, Israeli analysts processed over 43 hours of conversation, identifying 6 distinct voices, matching 4 of them to known operatives in intelligence databases, and extracting references to locations in Munich, Milan, Amsterdam and Paris that suggested a coordinated operation planned for mid-November. Al-Mabhouh was clearly the technical expert, providing detailed instructions on handling chemical compounds and discussing storage requirements that indicated the operation involved volatile materials. Hassan Khalil discussed financial arrangements totaling $3.7 million, which represented a substantial investment that suggested either multiple simultaneous attacks or a single high-casualty operation. The conversation that troubled analysts most occurred during the early morning hours of October 30th, when the children were asleep and Julia had gone to bed, leaving the 5 men alone to discuss operational security, which included references to compromised officials and advanced knowledge of surveillance schedules that indicated they had inside sources in at least 2 different agencies. Yael maintained her friendship with Julia throughout the next week, meeting for coffee twice and helping with shopping once. On November 4th, Julia mentioned that Marco would be traveling to Milan on November 7th for a 3-day academic conference, which aligned perfectly with the Milan meeting that Hamza had referenced. Yael reported this during her daily check-in, speaking into an encrypted phone while sitting in her car outside a grocery store. David Shamir informed her that the mission parameters had changed, that Caesarea operatives would be in Milan ready to conduct a capture operation, and that her role would expand to include real-time intelligence support. She said she understood. She ended the call. She sat in the car watching the rain and thinking about Sarah hugging that teddy bear, completely innocent, having no idea that her 7th birthday party had helped identify a terrorist network that planned to kill hundreds of people. Al-Mabhouh left for Milan on the morning of November 7th, carrying a small overnight bag and a leather briefcase. Julia kissed him goodbye at the apartment door, while Sarah sat at the kitchen table working on homework. A surveillance team photographed him entering Rome's Termini station and boarding the 10:15 train to Milan. He traveled alone. He carried no phone. He made no calls from public phones. His operational discipline was flawless. 8 Mossad operatives were already in Milan, positioned at locations intelligence analysts had identified as probable meeting sites based on the conversations recorded in the apartment. The primary location was a warehouse in the industrial district south of the city that belonged to an import-export company with documented connections to Hamas funding networks. Al-Mabhouh's train would arrive at 2:35 in the afternoon. The meeting was scheduled for 8 that evening. Everything was proceeding according to the intelligence they had gathered. That was when David Shamir received the call from Italian intelligence, informing him that Abu Nidal was not dead and was currently in Milan meeting with someone the Italians were very interested in identifying. The compromise between the Mossad and Italian intelligence had just become a 3-way problem. Someone had leaked the operation. The leak came from inside Italian intelligence, specifically from Antonio Benedetti, a senior officer who had been feeding information to Hamas networks for 18 months in exchange for payments totaling €200,000 deposited in a Swiss bank account. David Shamir discovered this 3 hours before the Milan meeting, when Mossad's internal security division traced the information flow and identified Benedetti as the source through phone records that showed calls to a known Hamas facilitator in Geneva. The discovery created an immediate tactical problem because Italian intelligence believed they were running an independent operation to capture Abu Nidal, which meant they would have surveillance teams and potentially tactical units positioned around the warehouse, creating the risk of a confrontation between Israeli and Italian operatives who did not know they were working the same target. Shamir had 2 choices: which were to abort the operation and lose the entire network, or proceed with the capture while simultaneously managing the Italian presence and ensuring Benedetti could not warn the targets. He chose to proceed because intelligence analysts had determined that the November 15th shipment to Munich contained precursor chemicals for sarin gas in quantities sufficient to kill thousands of people in an enclosed space. Yael arrived in Milan on the 3:20 afternoon train, carrying a small bag and a Canadian passport that identified her as Rachel Morrison, a graduate student researching Renaissance architecture. She met with the Caesarea team at a safe house 2 kilometers from the warehouse, receiving a detailed briefing on the tactical plan and her specific role, which was to provide real-time identification of targets as they arrived, because photographs and voice recognition alone might not be sufficient to confirm identities in the limited lighting conditions expected at the warehouse. The team commander was a man named Eli Rosen, 42 years old, veteran of operations in Lebanon and Gaza, carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had conducted captures in hostile territory dozens of times. He explained that Italian tactical units would be positioned on the north side of the warehouse, while Mossad operatives would approach from the south, creating a pincer movement that would trap anyone inside. The plan required precise timing to ensure the Italians did not move too early and alert the targets, which meant Shamir would need to coordinate directly with Italian intelligence command while keeping Benedetti isolated and unable to communicate with anyone. Al-Mabhouh arrived at the warehouse at 7:43, 17 minutes before the scheduled meeting time, which was exactly the kind of operational caution that had kept him alive and free for over a decade. He circled the block twice in a taxi before getting out, walked past the warehouse entrance once to check for surveillance, and only then entered through a side door that Mossad cameras captured in infrared. Hassan Khalil arrived at 7:55, Tariq Hamza at 8:02. The younger Lebanese man at 8:07, the older grey-haired man at 8:12. That made 5 confirmed targets inside. Intelligence suggested there would be 6, possibly 7 people at this meeting. 2 remained unaccounted for. At 8:17, a black Mercedes with diplomatic plates pulled up to the warehouse and 2 men exited. Yael, watching through a telescopic lens from a building 400 meters away, felt her breath catch. She recognized the first man from classified briefing files as Imad Fayez, the deputy commander of Hamas military operations in Europe, a man the Mossad had been hunting for 6 years and who was supposedly in Lebanon. The second man was older, perhaps 70, moving with the careful steps of someone whose body had survived too many years of violence. His face was unmistakable, even after 15 years. Abu Nidal was alive. The intelligence had been accurate. Everything they had risked, everything they had compromised had led to this moment. The capture operation began at 8:27 when Shamir gave the simultaneous authorization to both Israeli and Italian teams. Mossad operatives moved from the south in 2 groups of 4, wearing tactical gear but no insignia, carrying weapons that would not be traced to Israeli armories. Italian tactical units moved from the north with full SWAT equipment, believing they were capturing Abu Nidal and unknown associates. The warehouse had 2 exits, both now blocked. The walls were concrete, the windows were reinforced. There was nowhere for the targets to run. Eli Rosen's team reached the south entrance and placed breaching charges while a second team covered the loading dock. The Italians were positioning at the north entrance. Everything was synchronized. The breach would be simultaneous. 3, 2, 1. The explosions were perfectly timed, blowing both doors inward with enough force to stun anyone nearby, but not enough to bring down the structure. Mossad operatives poured through the south entrance, while Italians entered from the north, both teams moving with practiced efficiency toward the central meeting room that thermal imaging showed contained 8 human targets. The meeting room door was reinforced steel. It took 4 seconds to blow. Rosen was first through, weapon raised, shouting commands in Arabic. The 8 men inside were already moving, reaching for weapons, scattering toward corners that provided no cover. Hassan Khalil raised a pistol. 2 shots dropped him instantly. The younger Lebanese man tried to run through the breaching smoke. Italian officers tackled him to the concrete floor. Al-Mabhouh stood perfectly still, hands visible, recognizing that resistance meant death. Tariq Hamza was already on his knees, surrendering. Imad Fayez fought until a Mossad operative broke his arm and forced him down. The grey-haired older man tried to swallow something, probably a cyanide capsule, but Italian officers reached him first and prevented it. Abu Nidal did not resist. He stood calmly in the center of the chaos, watching Israeli and Italian operatives secure the room, his weathered face showing no emotion. He looked directly at Eli Rosen and spoke in perfect Hebrew, which he should not have known, saying words that would haunt everyone in that room for years. He said that they were too late. He said the shipment had already moved from Munich to Amsterdam 3 days ago. He said November 15th was misdirection, and the real operation would happen on November 9th, which was in 2 days. He said they had been chasing ghosts, while the actual weapon was already positioned in a subway station beneath Brussels, where it would be released during rush hour and kill at least 5,000 people. He said he had been waiting for them to find him, because dead men cannot be interrogated, and living men under custody could be used as proof that authorities were helpless to stop what was coming. Then he smiled. The room went silent, except for the sound of handcuffs clicking closed and the heavy breathing of operatives coming down from combat adrenaline. Rosen grabbed Abu Nidal by the throat and demanded details. The old terrorist said nothing more. Shamir was already on encrypted communications with Tel Aviv, relaying the information, requesting immediate coordination with Belgian intelligence. 2 days was not enough time to search an entire subway system. Abu Nidal could be lying, creating panic as a final operational objective. Or he could be telling the truth and 5,000 people would die in 48 hours because the Mossad had been chasing the wrong target while the real weapon moved into position. Yael watched from her observation post as prisoners were loaded into vehicles and driven away in 3 different directions to prevent any coordinated rescue attempts. She thought about Sarah hugging that teddy bear, about Julia making coffee in her kitchen, about the compromises that intelligence work demanded, and whether those compromises had been worth making. She did not have an answer. She suspected she never would. Belgian intelligence evacuated 4 subway stations in Brussels on November 8th, based on Mossad intelligence that reached them 7 hours after the Milan capture, creating massive disruption to the transit system and generating international media coverage that speculated about everything from bomb threats to gas leaks. Chemical weapons teams in full hazmat suits swept every platform, ventilation shaft and maintenance tunnel in the affected stations over a 12-hour period, while 2 million commuters found alternative transportation, and the Belgian government faced criticism for either overreacting to unverified intelligence or failing to protect citizens from an invisible threat depending on which news outlet was reporting. The search teams found nothing, which meant either Abu Nidal had been lying as a final act of psychological warfare, or the weapon had never been positioned in Brussels, or it had already been moved after the Milan capture compromised the operation. David Shamir spent 48 hours without sleep, running parallel interrogations of the 7 captured operatives, using techniques that would never appear in official reports, but which extracted information that saved lives, even if the methods could not be publicly acknowledged. The truth emerged on November 10th, when Tariq Hamza, after 36 hours of interrogation, revealed that Abu Nidal had indeed been lying, but not about everything, which was the most dangerous kind of misdirection because it contained enough truth to seem credible while directing resources away from the actual threat. The sarin precursors were real and had been moved to Amsterdam, but not for a subway attack. They were destined for 3 separate car bombs that would detonate simultaneously outside the American Embassy, the British Consulate, and the Israeli Cultural Center on November 16th, during a joint diplomatic reception that would be attended by over 400 government officials, intelligence officers, and civilians. The tactical shift from enclosed subway attack to open-air car bombs meant lower casualties but higher symbolic impact, striking 3 allied nations simultaneously and demonstrating that Hamas could operate with impunity in the heart of Europe. Dutch intelligence, working with Mossad operatives who had been rushed to Amsterdam, located 2 of the 3 vehicles within 18 hours by tracing the import company that Tariq had identified during interrogation. The 3rd vehicle was found abandoned in a parking garage with the detonation system already installed, but not yet armed, suggesting the cell responsible for that bomb had received warning about the Milan capture and decided to abort, rather than risk capture themselves. Al-Mabhouh never stood trial. He died in an Italian maximum security prison on December 3, 1997, of an apparent heart attack that Italian authorities ruled natural causes, despite the fact he was 40 years old, with no history of cardiac problems, and had received a medical examination 2 weeks before that showed no health concerns. The autopsy revealed nothing suspicious because the method used left no traces that standard toxicology could detect. Hassan Khalil survived his gunshot wounds and spent the next 8 years in Italian custody, before being extradited to Israel in 2005, where he remains in Ayalon prison, serving a life sentence. Imad Fayez negotiated a deal that provided information on Hamas operations throughout Europe, in exchange for a reduced sentence and relocation to an undisclosed country under a new identity. Tariq Hamza was released in 2001 as part of a prisoner exchange and reportedly returned to Lebanon, where he kept a low profile until his death from cancer in 2012. Abu Nidal committed suicide in Italian custody on November 20, 1997, using a method that prison officials never publicly explained, though rumors suggested Israeli intelligence had facilitated his death to prevent the revelations that a public trial would produce. Yael Ravid continued working for the Mossad until 2004, when she resigned following an operation in Madrid that required compromises she could no longer justify. She returned to Israel using her real name for the first time in 12 years, enrolled in graduate school at Hebrew University, completed a doctorate in psychology focusing on the long-term effects of deception on intelligence operatives, and currently works as a therapist in Tel Aviv, specializing in treating former intelligence officers who struggle with the moral complexities of their previous work. She has never married. She does not discuss her Mossad career, except in the most general terms. She has never contacted Giulia Rossini or asked what happened to the family after Marco's death, though she knows from classified reports that Italian authorities told Giulia her husband died of a heart attack in prison while being held on financial fraud charges. She thinks about Sarah often, wondering if the girl who is now a woman in her early 30s still has that teddy bear, or if it was thrown away years ago when childhood toys stopped mattering. Giulia Rossini learned the truth about her husband in 2008 when an investigative journalist published a book about Hamas operations in Europe that identified Marco Rossini as Mahmoud Al-Mabhouh and detailed his role in planning chemical weapons attacks. The revelation destroyed her, not just because the man she had loved was a terrorist, but because she had to accept that their entire relationship had been a lie constructed for operational cover. She moved back to Naples with Sarah, changed their last name to her maiden name of Constantino, and rebuilt their lives away from the media attention that followed the book's publication. She never remarried. She teaches piano at a music conservatory. Sarah graduated from university with a degree in international relations, worked briefly for an NGO focused on conflict resolution, and now lives in London working for a consulting firm. Neither mother nor daughter has ever spoken publicly about Marco or what they learned about his real identity and activities. David Shamir retired from the Mossad in 2003 after 31 years of service and currently lives in Jerusalem with his wife and 4 grandchildren. He has given several classified briefings to Israeli security officials about the evolution of terrorist tactics in Europe, but refuses all media requests and has never confirmed or denied his involvement in specific operations. Antonio Benedetti was arrested by Italian authorities in January 1998, convicted of espionage and treason, and served 14 years in prison before his release in 2012. He died in 2016 in a car accident that Italian authorities ruled accidental, despite persistent rumors that former colleagues in Italian intelligence had arranged his death as punishment for his betrayal. The operation that began with a 7-year-old girl hugging a teddy bear at her birthday party prevented the deaths of hundreds of people and dismantled a terrorist network that had been operating in Europe for 5 years. The ethical cost of using an innocent child as an unwitting courier remains a subject of intense debate within the intelligence community. The operatives who planned and executed the mission believe the ends justified the means. Sarah Constantino, now 35 years old, has never learned that her 7th birthday party helped the Mossad stop a terrorist attack. She does not need to know. Some secrets protect the innocent by remaining forever hidden.